All right, good morning, students. Let's go ahead and get started. I've got the recording going now, so anything you say may be used against you in a court of law.
You do.
And I still don't see a clock anyplace on my computer, so I might need to have a time reminder back there if I start getting long-winded. Okay, so today is Wednesday, October the 3rd. Okay, is it anybody's birthday today?
Yeah.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it is our daughter Laura's birthday today. So, all right, so to begin with, we're going to have a little spiritual thought. Did anybody come prepared with that one today? I don't think we assigned anybody to do that, so I guess that means it's my turn again. And then we're going to have an opening prayer. Who gave the opening prayer last week?
I did.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Well, I'm going to ask Jaquel for us today, okay? But let me read you this scripture first. And this is a list of gems in my what is this app called? The LDS Scriptures. I have a tag section called education, and when I have come across scriptures that have to do with education, I've highlighted them in this section right here. And you can just write this reference down in your notes. It's not going to be on the quiz, but it's one that I think is a good one to remember when you want to know what do the scriptures teach us about education. And this comes from the Book of Mormon. If you remember King Benjamin in the Book of Mosiah, before the end of his life, he decided to change the organization of the political structure of his people. He was a king, but he didn't think it was such a good idea to have kings. And in Mosiah chapter 23 is where I'm coming from today, but also that whole process is detailed more fully in chapter 29 of Mosiah. And one of the really, really important phrases that is in these chapters about not having a king, but having the people be subject, you could say it was a constitutional republic, because the law was higher than the king. Okay, now when you have a monarchy, you have a king, the king is the law, and whatever he says is the law. And not only that, the king himself is typically not subject to the law. He is above the law. He can do whatever he wants, okay, just because he's the king. How many of you want to be a king? Yeah. Okay, back in the history of England, remember 1215 and a document called Magna Carta? You're at a serious disadvantage because we're starting in 1492 and you have a blank slate on everything that happened before 1492. But fortunately, we're going to cover some of that today. We're going to try to set the stage for 1492. And that means we have to touch on the things that happened in the previous key date, which is 1200. Well, one of the important things that happened was the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta were a bunch of the aristocrats, the barons and the nobles in the country of England got together and said, we are going to force the king to sign this document which says he is not above the law. He can't do things that all the rest of us are bound to do according to the laws of the country. Okay, and that was groundbreaking. That was a new concept, that the king would have to be subject to the law. So anyway, back in the Book of Mormon, Mosiah said, what I was mentioning is that every man would be willing to be responsible for their own sins. Okay, and he said that was one of the things that they indicated, that they were willing to do away with kings and to have self-government according to the laws which had been given not by the king but by the Lord. He said, we are going to obey these laws, and these laws are the highest thing. Everybody is subject to these laws, even the king. Okay, and every man was willing to be responsible for his own sins. And I really got myself going on a tangent here that is not part of what I'm supposed to be teaching you today. But let me ask you this question. When would a man not be responsible for his own sins? How can you commit sins and not be responsible for them? If there was a way to do that, wouldn't that be kind of cool?
Blame Adam. Blame Adam.
Blame Adam.
Yeah, they say the sins of Adam upon our heads. We can't help it. The sins of Adam are on our heads.
So how does that allow me to commit sins and they not be my fault?
Oh, it doesn't. But
Well, there is a way for you to commit sins and have it not be your fault.
Money.
By money? You pay somebody else to be responsible for your sins? Say, I'm going to go shoplift something out of Walmart, and I want you to stand there and let them arrest you while I walk out with my stuff that I shoplifted. Will they do that? No, they won't do that. Well, that is a mystery. There is a way for us to commit sins and not be responsible for them. And I'm going to explain that to you later, but not today. And here's what he said in chapter 23. First of all, he says in verse 13, stand fast in this liberty wherewith ye have been made free, and that ye trust no man to be a king over you. He's talking about all of the terrible things that happened under King Noah. And then here in verse 14, and trust no one to be your teacher, nor your minister, except he be a man of God, walking in his ways and keeping his commandments. So, trust no one to be your teacher, except he be a man of God. Do I qualify under that condition? I hope so. I'm trying to, but here's the point. You don't go around asking just anybody to teach you what you want to learn, because of what we talked about last week. What was it we talked about last week? Education is indoctrination. Did you ever know anybody who graduated from medical school and then went home and said, man, that's a bunch of voodoo. I think we need to do muscle testing and comfrey on our injuries? They never said that, did they? They said just the opposite. Muscle testing and comfrey, that's a bunch of voodoo. Because they are indoctrinated, they believe the things they have learned. Those things that you study and you invest time and money in learning become your truth. And so, and you can't avoid that. You know, some people say, we're going to go teach our children in public school or wherever else, and we're not teaching them values, we're just giving them knowledge. Like 2 + 2 is 4. And there's no value associated with 2 + 2 is 4. That's just a fact. But is it? And what I'm saying to you is that even in teaching that 2 + 2 is 4, there is a value associated with that. 2 + 2 is 4, and that's a good thing. Or maybe that's not a good thing. I'm saying even in learning something as what you might consider to be value-free as math, there are values associated with it in the way that you learn it. Okay? So, Mosiah chapter 23, verse 14, be careful about who you hire to be your teachers, because you're going to wind up thinking like them, acting like them, believing like them, and if you want to be a good person, you should choose people to teach you who you respect and admire, and in particular, Mosiah says, men of God, who walk in his ways and keep his commandments, and then you're more likely to wind up that same way yourself. Okay? All right, that's a quick little inspirational message. Let me pause the recording, and we'll have our prayer. If I can figure out how to make this thing Alt-P. Okay, so to start out class today, I'm going to give you your quiz. And so you can close your books and your notes. And then you should be able to answer these questions in about probably no more than 5 minutes. Probably more like 3 or 2. As a matter of fact, I'm embarrassed because they're so easy.
I didn't reflect that.
Okay, well, due to the marvels of modern technology, it turns out we messed up the recording situation last Wednesday in class. And so for those of you that were not there, I'm going to go back and try to piece together the pieces that were missing for you. Turns out I didn't get the recording turned on at the point that we began to review the quiz questions from the first week. So let me start with that, and if you've got your quiz there with you from the first week, then open up to that, and I'll go through the correct answers for you, and then you'll be able to score your quiz and turn that into me next time you see me. So question number 1, which definition fits the words history? That would be A, is the actual events that happened in the past is history. Whereas in number 2, which definition fits the word historiography? That would be B, the things that someone has written about those past events. And as we discussed in our first class, those always have some particular problems. And number 3 says, what were 2 problems that we discussed with the study of history? They are B, writer's agenda and bias. Those are the 2 that we discussed in class. Number 4, true or false, many famous historical events or the details of the events are complete fabrications. I gave you several examples of that in class, so the answer to number 4 is true. Number 5, we mentioned a few particular examples of popular myths in U.S. history. Which one was not one of them? Of those 4 things that are listed, I think they were all on the slide with the exception of D, Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Which is not to say that that story is also not a fabrication, but at any rate, that was not one of the ones that we discussed. Number 6, which organization or group is the largest consumer of history books in the country? And that would be C, government schools. And number 7, word number 1 is an example of what word. We talked about the definition of several vocabulary words in class last week, but the one that fits with word number 1 is D, hubris, which is arrogant pride. Number 8, we discussed several good reasons for studying history. Which one was not one of them? Well, of all the ones we did not talk about, the one that we did not talk about is D, to cure insomnia. And of course, insomnia means inability to fall asleep. And certainly a study of history should not cure that problem for you. Although I can understand if it does sometimes. Number 9, true or false, by nature people are greedy or lazy. We talked about this in class, and greedy or lazy are negative, pejorative, or epithetical terms. But we talked about the fact that in human nature would prefer more of a good thing to less of a good thing. If you had a job that offered $15 an hour versus a job that offered only $10 an hour, you would choose the job that paid you $15 because $15 is better than $10 for the same amount of time and work. So by that standard, someone could accuse you of being greedy because you want more for the same amount of money or effort. But that's not necessarily, in the context that I'm using it, economically speaking, part of human nature. It's a good thing to get something more for less money or effort. And lazy is just the opposite. We want to, as part of our human nature, do the least amount of work as possible in order to get the same results. So number 9 is true, T for true. And number 10, history helps us to fill in the blanks here. I've given you the first letter of each of the correct words that goes in these blanks. And when you fill them in, it would read, history helps us avoid the errors of the past, solve the problems of the present, and more accurately predict the future. Okay? The bonus question is an example of the kinds of bonus question that I'm typically going to ask when something comes up in class that is an important point, but which is not clear because it's kind of maybe a side note to one of the things that we're discussing. So a lot of times in class I'll say something like, well, that would be a good bonus question. That's a cue for you to look something up or do some extra research on your own on an interesting topic that we touched on but was not necessarily a question that was answered in class. And that was the case of when last week we were talking about the invention of the airplane in 1903 by the Wright brothers. There was a man I mentioned, but I couldn't remember his name, that had been paid by the government to develop and invent an airplane. And it turns out his name was Samuel Pierpont Langley. And you'll know Langley, Virginia is named after him. That's the place where CIA headquarters is located today. He was paid $50,000 from the War Department, which today is the Department of Defense, in 1898. And also another $20,000 from the Smithsonian Institution or Museum in order to develop an airplane. And he actually built several airplanes that never did fly. They were launched off of barges on the Potomac River, and each time he went out there to test them, they crashed spectacularly and never did really do anything that could be called flying. Wasn't even actually like Buzz Lightyear falling with style or something like that. But the Smithsonian Museum, in order to preserve their reputation, actually put one of his airplane contraptions on display, and with the description that this was the first man-carrying aeroplane in the history of the world capable of sustained free flight, which was a lie, pure and simple, because he certainly did not invent such a machine. Okay, so if you had the answer to the bonus question, then you would add an extra 10 points to your score. You need to take questions 1 through 10 and give yourself 10 points for each correct answer. And in the case of number 10, where there are, I think, 5 blanks that can be filled in, give yourself 2 points for each correct blank that you filled in. Calculate your score and put that at the top of your paper and turn that into me when you see me next time. Okay, now turning back to our slides, we're starting with our key date of 1492, and the first thing I intend to do is give you an overview. And so as I talked about the key dates last week, you remember that the theory behind the studying of the key dates is kind of like the rooms in your house. And so when I talk about 1492, I'm going to give you a list of the items of furniture, if you will, or the items that are going to be included in this room or this key date of 1492. The first thing we want to talk about, the main event of this is, of course, the colonization and discovery of America by Christopher Columbus. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the events and the conditions in the world leading up to the time that Christopher Columbus actually made his voyage. And so we're going to call that setting the world stage for the discovery of America. What were the things that were happening in the world that kind of made everything just right conditionally for Christopher Columbus to make his historic voyage? And that's going to be the subject of our class today. Then we'll go into detail on the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus, how he grew up and was prepared to make the trips that he did, and what motivated him, which is an important question that we're going to want to answer. As a matter of fact, this week we're going to be celebrating Columbus Day, which is the date that Columbus landed in at the end of his voyage into the New World. And you'll notice that if you have an American history calendar on your telephone or something, there's another special holiday that is being celebrated the very same day, which is called Indigenous Peoples Day. Because it turns out the indigenous peoples, or the Native Americans, the Indians, if you will, Don't really look at Christopher Columbus as a hero. As a matter of fact, he's the great villain. So we'll want to understand about him. Was he a good guy or a bad guy? We're going to talk about the Reformation and all of its principal players. The Reformation, of course, is talking about the Reformation of the Catholic Church and this big movement that was started to change or to correct the errors that had crept into the Catholic Church over the centuries from the time that the apostles were alive. King Henry VIII of England, there's a long train of kings and queens of England, and most of them are probably not worth remembering too much about as an American. If you were a British citizen, you probably would want to learn more about the history of the monarchy of England. But there are a few of them that had a significant impact on the course of world events, and in particular on the course of American events. And one of those is King Henry VIII of England. And of course, he was also one of the characters associated with the Reformation. And so we're going to have to talk about him and understand his role in that important event, and how that also was an event that led to the influencing on the American colonies. We'll talk about exploration and colonization. There were not just Columbus, but many brave, courageous, enterprising, entrepreneurial type explorers that came from not only Portugal, but also Spain and France and the Netherlands, and of course Great Britain. And we'll talk about some of those important key players and the settlements that they were responsible for establishing on the American continent, both North and South and Central America. And let's see what else. We've got the American or the English colonies. There were, of course, Spanish-speaking colonies that you're familiar with. There was Portuguese-speaking colonies. Remember Brazil, the primary language there is Portuguese. That's because it was settled by Portuguese explorers. Mexico and Central America largely speak Spanish because they were colonized and conquered by Spanish explorers. So we'll learn who some of those important characters were and where they went and what they accomplished. And that'll lead us up to discussion of the Pilgrims and some of the incorrect myths that Americans generally believe about the Pilgrims, the establishment of religious colonies in what has later become the United States of America. So our first event that you will have learned about in our previous key date, which is 1200 BC, and all these things that I'm going to list as setting the stage for Columbus were important events that were discussed in detail in our 1200 AD section. But since we skipped over that, you haven't had the chance to study those in detail yet. But as part of a larger conflict between France and England, which was called the 100 Years' War, there's this special episode that involved a young girl, a teenage girl, who has come to be known as Joan of Arc. Of course, she was not Joan of Arc during her lifetime, but actually within a few hundred years after her death or her martyrdom, she was canonized or made into a saint by the Catholic Church because they believed that she actually saw visions and performed miracles. So in 1431, remember we're working up to 1492. So you're looking there at 61 years before Columbus's voyage. We have this significant event of the martyrdom of Joan of Arc. That's a story that you should know and is well worth your time to study. But as I said, it was covered in our previous. It would have been covered in our previous key date, and I'm not going to take the time to go through it with you in this class. But that is one of the things that is kind of setting the culture or the ideas that people have in their mind up to the time that Columbus is ready to make his voyage. Another really important event was the development by Johannes Gutenberg of movable printing type and oil-based ink, which facilitated the publication of printed works. Some people incorrectly attribute the invention of the printing press to Gutenberg. He did not invent the printing press. He invented only what's called movable type. When the first printing press was first invented, they carved the letters and pictures, whatever they wanted to print, on wooden blocks, and then they put the ink on those and then pressed them onto a piece of paper, and they did the printing that way. And Gutenberg's contribution to the process was to take each of the letters and carve them onto a piece of metal which is called a type, and then those letters could be individually stacked up into rows, and this was basically in 1450 the same technology that was used for the printing of the Book of Mormon. If any of you ever had the chance to visit the Grandin Building in Palmyra or in Nauvoo, they also have the church has a nice display of it there, of how this process occurred, and it's very, very interesting to see how they accomplished that. But the thing that was that really was important as far as Gutenberg's development of this printing type is that he was actually able to publish the Bible, and he took and printed page by page up and published copies of the Bible. We said handwritten copies required 20 years for a single month to complete. I don't know if that was working full time on it. If you were to sit down and hand copy the entire Old Testament and New Testament, do you think you could get it done in less than 20 years? I think you probably could. But if in the meantime you also had to hoe your garden, to grow your food, and make your paper, make your ink, make your pencil, it probably would take you 20 years. So this was a rare and precious commodity that Gutenberg was able to make much less expensive. You know, something that required 20 years to produce is going to be much more rare and expensive than something that can be produced in a period of weeks. I've got on the slide here, cost an average wage earner 3 years' wages to purchase one of these Bibles. And that, I think we talked in class about the idea of the fact that if you make $10 an hour and you work 2,000 hours a year, which is the normal on a 40-hour work week, there's 50 weeks in a year, so that's 2,000 hours in a year, and so 2,000 hours at $10 an hour is $20,000, and 3 of those would be $60,000. You know, that is like the price of a new automobile. But a Bible became one of the most prized possessions that people could own, and families purchased them and handed them down from generation to generation in their families. And of course they kept their very important family records in those Bibles, because they knew that those were very valuable things that would not be lost. And because of that, the Bible became much more widely available for people to read, and so they became able to examine the Gospels and the Scriptures for themselves and come to their own understanding of the things that were taught in there, the doctrines that were taught in there. And this was one of the factors that led to the Reformation, that we'll talk in detail about a little later. Now, 1453, now we're up to only just 41 years before Columbus's voyage. We've got the city of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox Church, that has now been conquered by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, these were Turkish Arab Muslims from Turkey, and came over, and of course Constantinople is actually in their country today, and it's located a very strategically important location geographically, where it guards the passageway between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea, or the gateway to the Mediterranean. So it's a very strategically important city. But this was one of the factors where we see that the Muslim world, or the Islamic faith, is gaining political power, whereas over on Western Europe, over in Spain, they were actually losing political power, and that was another important thing. That same year, we have the French win after 100 years of on again, off again fighting. It's actually more than, it was about 109 years total from the beginning to end of this war that was continuously ongoing between France and Britain. And the objective for France was to drive the British off of their shores. France believed that their destiny was to control all of their country clear out to the ocean, whereas the British kings, remember the King of Normandy, William the Conqueror, went. You don't remember that because you weren't here for when we had our class on 1200 AD. But they were French kings that went over and conquered England, and they considered that those areas on the northern shores of France to be part of England, part of Great Britain, and so that was their territory, and that was a conflict that went on during all the latter years of that key date. Remember the Crusades? We didn't talk about the Crusades because we haven't done that in that class, but that was an issue even during the Crusades when the Europeans were allied together to go to battle against the Arabs over in Palestine. So 1453 finally marks the end of that, and the French define their territory, and we've got Britain and France both becoming dominant world powers, where they are the countries to be reckoned with. They've been fighting each other, but still they're the two largest, strongest militarily, economically speaking, which was a factor that contributed to this reaching out towards colonization. And colonization was an important part of the British mercantile economic system. And we'll probably talk about that in more detail. Okay, and that's going to bring us up to the Renaissance. And that Renaissance happens during the 13th to the 17th century. We talked in class about this idea of naming centuries and getting clear in our minds that the 13th century is talking about the years 1201 to 1300. The first year of the 13th century is 1201, and the last year of the 13th century is 1300. Okay, so the 13th century is all of the 1200s. The 17th century is all of the 1600s. Okay, and that shouldn't confuse you as you're studying history. Historians have a way of naming centuries, like for example, we live right now in the 21st century, but our year begins with the number 20. 2018 we live in, but we're in the 21st century. We'll talk about the 18th century when we're talking about the colonization of America, the 1700s, and the 19th century would be the 1800s. Okay, so the Renaissance is what we're talking about, this 400-year period between the 1200s to the 1600s for something that we have in Europe called the Renaissance. Now, I believe at this point the recording that I made of class is turned back on, so I'm going to stop right here and splice this together. Hopefully that you'll be able to pick up where I'm leaving off on the other recording.
Resume recording. Okay, let's start with the first 100 years. What's the number of the first year?
180.
1. Okay. What's the number of the last year? 100 is the last year. 1 to 100. That's the first century. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 16, 19, 20, 40, 30, 70. Those are all the first century. The first century is the years that don't even have 100 on them. Okay? What's the first year of the second century? 101, right. Okay, 100 is the last year of the first century. 101 is the first year of the second century. 102, 103, 107, 109, 199, 200. That's the last year of the second century. 200 is the last year of the second century. What century are we in right now? We are in the 21st century, but what do our years start with? 20. All the 20s is the 21st century. So when I'm saying 13th century, I'm talking about the 1200s. And I say 17th century, I'm talking about the 1600s. Okay?
So it's always a year ahead of what it really is.
The number of the century is higher than the year that you're talking about. Okay, so if I say 1776, what century was that in? The 18th century, right? Okay, so get that straight in your mind. That's probably going to be a quiz question. Okay, so what happened to the Renaissance? The Renaissance began in Italy and spread to all of Europe by the 16th century. Okay, so here in Italy, by the way, in the 13th century, Italy, actually it was not until in the 1860s that Italy became a country as we know it today. In this period of time we're talking about, Italy was about 250 countries, okay? Florence was a country, Venice was a country, Milan was a country, Rome was a country, it's called the Papal States. Okay, basically every city was its own country, had its own government, had its own, well, I don't know if they had they probably had their own kind of money, but they didn't call themselves Italy. They were not a country as we speak of them today. But that's where this all started. And as I said, this was a tremendous new birth of interest in the ancient classics of ancient Greece and Rome. And this was their heritage. This is where they came from. It was characterized by a renewal of scholarship, widespread access to books, especially the Bible. And how did that happen? Well, because of Gutenberg. And advancements in art, sculpture, science, and religion. Okay? And when I say advancements in science, that included the science of geography. The ancient Greeks had figured out how to calculate the circumference of the earth by looking at the angle to the sun in two different places on the earth that were a known distance apart. Okay, so I could go to one place, measure the angle of the sun at a certain time, goes 500 miles away, measure the angle of the sun, and then I would have a geometric, you hear about Pythagorean theorem, and yeah, you got the ancient Greece to thank for all of that math you have to study and learn. They figured all that stuff out. And during the Dark Ages, we call the Dark Ages, a lot of that knowledge that it was not generally known. And people were subject to superstition and tradition, and the idea that if you sailed out of the sight of land, you would fall off the edge of the earth, and there was monsters out there that would eat you. Okay, that kind of thing. Okay, ancient Greeks knew better than that. They knew the earth was round. The Odyssey. Is that? Oh, that's what happened in the Odyssey.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so why was this important? Well, this is established, because of we say human nature. Man is lazy and greedy. There's another element of human nature which we could add to that list, which is curious. Okay, man has, and Plato wrote about human nature. He said man is that creature that has the ability to ask, what is man? Okay, introspection. But curious. Okay, so because of this rebirth of art, science, religion, then we have the idea of exploration. We want to go past the limits of known knowledge and learn something more. Okay, that's contributing to the climate for Columbus. Notable Renaissance personalities would include Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and many others probably underlined because there's far more than a few. There are just a lot of names that could be added to this list in all the different fields. Leonardo da Vinci is really a fascinating character. If you can find a good book about Leonardo da Vinci, he was an inventor, he was an architect.
I don't know.
He dissected human bodies.
Yeah, that's what bothers me about it.
You know, and there had been a prohibition against that in the Muslim faith, that it was a sacrilege, and you know, it's like how could physicians learn about anatomy when they were forbidden to ever look at the inside of a body? I mean, even after a person died and they knew the type of disease that the person had, they could not cut the guy open and look at what was wrong in there. Okay, but during the Renaissance, this was happening. Da Vinci wrote that he had dissected as many as 10 human cadavers. And artists did this. They would dissect it so they could study the structure of the muscles and the bones. So because during the Renaissance, the artists get the idea. If you look at medieval art, it's kind of boxy, kind of plain. And, you know, during the Renaissance, they invented or they developed perspective and how to draw things bigger and smaller and vanishing points. And they gave great attention to the human anatomy, and the sculptures the same thing. And they wanted it to be more realistic. As you saw that picture of the Mona Lisa, that was considered a masterpiece because of the subtle expression on her face. And so that's characteristic of the.
Can I ask a question? Was that a portrait of himself?
Who?
Leonardo. Was Mona Lisa a portrait of him?
No, it was the portrait of a lady that was named Lisa. She was the wife of a nobleman. See, artists and architects, you know, sculptures, they became wealthy by providing art to decorate the rich peoples and the churches. Okay, so there was a lot of religious art that was done during this time, and sculptures. And I was going to mention one of the things that made for this boom in the artistic endeavors was the bubonic plague, which was in about 1350, the first time it showed up. The bubonic plague came into Europe and wiped out between 1/2 and 3/4 of the population of all of these major population centers. And this was one of the things that we learned when we studied 1200 AD, the bubonic plague. Now, if you take 1/2 of the population of Burley and all of a sudden they disappear, what are you going to have left? What happens to all the stuff of the dead people? All their gold, all their silver, all their houses, all their cars. Still there, right? All the stuff is still there. So the bubonic plague actually resulted in a concentration of available wealth that the rich people who were able to acquire all of this material property from the people that died spent lavishly on artists and architects, and then building new buildings and cathedrals and making new sculptures and statues and paintings and portraits and things. Okay, so that was interesting. Okay, I am boogieing into my last or second to the last thing I need to tell you, and that's the Spanish Inquisition. And what is it that you need to know about the Spanish Inquisition? Well, starting with in 1478, remember our key date is 1492, so we're still before. The Pope of the Catholic Church said, we need to have an Inquisition. We need to purify the church. We've got a lot of heretics in here. We've got people that are teaching false doctrine. We've got people that are practicing sorceries and witchcrafts, and we've got to find these people and we've got to get rid of them in order to purify the church. And so we're going to have an Inquisition, which is we're going to inquire, we're going to find out who is evil, and we're going to get rid of them by execution.
So
Okay.
The definition of inquisition is to basically inquire.
Yes, they come from the same words. And the Inquisition, so the Pope ordered this, and he sends emissaries throughout the country to investigate any accusations of heresy. Okay, heresy is when you say something or you teach something that is contrary to the approved doctrine of the church. So, for example, Copernicus, he was teaching that the earth revolves around the sun, not the sun around the earth. Well, that was a heresy. Okay, and that was something he should have to be executed for teaching. Okay, so
Was the Earth being the center of the universe? Was that church doctrine?
yes, it was. It was doctrine. It was the approved doctrine. It was the only thing that could be taught or publicly believed. Okay, so in Spain, we've got this Inquisition going on that's being supported by the king and the queen, and you're getting thousands of people that are rounded up and being killed. And the way they put them on trial is they put them on the rack, or they torture them some way, waterboard them. They stretch their hands, they tie them up by their hands, tie their feet to the floor, and then tighten up the rope and get you tighter and tighter, and a bunch of other things that are not even PG rated that I could tell you about, just to find out if you were an evil person. And they would say, did you ever do this? Did you ever hear that? Did you ever see this? And when you're being tortured, pretty much you're going to say, yes, just stop. And they say, okay, you're guilty. And then they take you out and kill you. Okay. And so this was a terrible, severe time. We've got a fellow whose name you associate with the Spanish Inquisition, Tomás de Torquemada, ordered as many as 2,000 heretics burned at the stake. Yeah, they would burn them, but they also just killed them by torture. In 1486, his famous book, Malleus Maleficarum, which is translated, that's a Latin word, the hammer for witches, which is a manual for discovering, apprehending, interrogating, and executing witches. And throughout the country, as many as 135,000, mostly women, were killed, were executed. Okay?
There weren't really that many witches. I really doubt that there was that many.
No, there really wasn't that many witches. These were just people that were caught in the crossfire. Okay, so what did this have to do with Christopher Columbus? Well, part of this Inquisition was also directed against Jews and Muslims. Okay, they are infidels. They are the ones we got to get rid of. And so in Spain, they actually were having a war going on between these religious.
Oh.
We can look at it when he says it.
Let me see what happened. Okay, we already said this already. Using this manual, hundreds of thousands, mostly women, were killed throughout Europe. Okay, so it wasn't just in Spain. And in Spain, the Inquisition was used to expel Jews and Moors. Moors are Arabs, okay? Or to force their conversion to Christianity. And here's the bottom line. By July of 1492, the Spanish conquistadors, the army, the military people of Spain, finally succeeded in their ultimate victory over the Moors and driving them out of the country. And when you end a war, that's a good thing for you because wars are very expensive. And it turns out that Ferdinand and Isabella believed that their victory over the Moors in 1492 was a sign from God that they were the favored faith, the favored religion, and that they needed to do something to show their gratitude to God for their success in that war.
Wait, what was? Oh, because they won the war, they saw it as a sign from God.
Yes. Yeah, that was a stamp of approval by God upon them for what they had done.
This is an apogee of the time period, I don't know.
This is what?
An apogee of evil, is that what,
Oh.
Can I use it like that? I haven't used that word.
I don't know, maybe. I guess you might think of that. Okay, I'm done right there. I'm going to quit. It's 9:19, so I'm actually not too far over time. Any questions or comments before we say till next time?
Was the war the Spanish Inquisition, I'm assuming? So what was the war that Spain won in?
1492?
Yeah, was that the Inquisition? Oh no, I wouldn't classify that.